So, anything you want to talk about, Mr. Rucker, before we bring the jury back in and you continue with your direct exam, Mr. Weitzel?
I'm just asking.
Got you mid-bite, sorry about that.
It's okay, I'm trying to not choke to death. Just want to know, of course, has thought a little bit more about, I understand where you are on one end of the scale. Have you moved at all to any closer to my request?
I'd like to hear the defense perspective on the question at hand, which is, as I understand it, the propriety of allowing the jurors now in the midst of the presentation of evidence to be given the opportunity to try to pull the trigger on the gun from the SUV, as opposed to them doing it during deliberations, because I've already opined that they may do, and you may encourage them to do so. And I've found case law that says that's okay. You are saying, well, why don't we do it now, setting aside all the safety concerns, because those are very manageable. I'm not focused on that. So, Mr. Harvey or Mr. Samuel or Ms. Clark-Palmer, anyone on that? Mr. Harvey.
Well, again, I think that was essentially a notice of intent to warning for reconsideration. My specialty, and I think he's come up in that. But I do think there is a distinct difference between doing it now, in which if one person wants to do it, there's a little bit different kind of pressure to do it, and the inability to discuss it, between now and when they're sent out for deliberation.
It's more like 12 pounds of pressure if it happens now, as opposed to 2 pounds if it's in the jury.
It's double action now, single action if we're back there. So I think it changes the dynamic totally.
How is it different from passing a photo around, or I couldn't find any cases. I'm just trying to think. It might happen more on the civil side. Here is the example of the knee joint, and the jurors can all look at it because the expert has just talked about how the knee joint works.
I don't think in that there's a physical manipulation of the actual item. I think a physical manipulation of the actual item is different in both substance and form than looking at a picture or looking at a demonstration. I don't know if the jurors if you've got a skeleton they're allowed to go like this. Hey, that knee works pretty well. So that would be my response.
Okay.
Just as an aside, so for instance, once I believe with this witness we'd be able to link up the chain for the gun. We've already established where it was collected. I think that evidence has come in, so I know the gun is in evidence. But you kind of link up the chain to talk about the ballistics part of the case. So if during Mr. Weitzel's examination on direct, I asked the court for permission to publish the gun by handing it to a juror and allow them to look at it up close, look at the shrouded hammer, and then pass it from juror to juror, would that be permissible?
Sure. I think that's the looking at that occurs. Historically, it occurred all the time because the way you published anything,
right,
you had to hand your paper copy.
I remember those days. Yeah,
we both do.
Yeah,
and I think that practice is allowable. And I'm not saying that I find anything that rises to the level of I've got concern it's reversible error. I just would stay away from it because it can, and I suspect will happen during deliberations, but that's the time when the inquiring mind ought to say, well, let me try that, and gosh, that's easy to do, or it's hard to do, whatever their conclusion is. And to Mr. Harvey's point, that's when you have the discussion. Oh my gosh, that was so much easier or harder than I thought it would be. What do you think about it?
Okay.
And that ought not to happen when they take their next break. And I tell them not to do it, but I tell them a whole lot of things, and so far, we've been doing just fine with that.
Yeah.
I'd rather not add to that list. So, if you would like to have the firearm circulate at a certain point during Mr. Weitzel's testimony, that's fine, but it's going to have, I don't want them pulling the trigger, so I don't know what parts you want to remove, or I can just direct them not to try to operate the firearm, just look at it.
Okay. It does have the safety lock still on.
I'm sure, I just wasn't sure if you were going to need to remove something so they could see the part that you think is important.
No.
Okay, then that'll address it. So, for now, I'm going to decline your request, Mr. Rucker, to allow jurors to pull the trigger on the firearm, but you understand the leeway that will be out there during their deliberations. Okay? All right. Anything else before we bring the jury back in? Mr. Harvey, let's get him in, please.
All jurors are present and accounted for, Judge.
Thank you. You all may be seated. Welcome back from lunch. You may recall Mr. Weitzel. He was the gentleman that you were getting to meet before we broke for lunch. He remains under oath and on direct examination. Mr. Rucker.
Yes. Mr. Weitzel, can you tell the jurors, are you a member of any professional organizations?
I'm not currently a member. However, I am in the application process for the Association of Firearms and Toolmark Examiners.
Okay.
Firearm and what else?
Excuse me?
Firearm and...
Firearms and Toolmark Examiners.
And can you tell the jurors, in the course of your time there as GBI, how many firearms examinations have you performed?
I've done somewhere over 750 cases.
Okay. And can you tell the jury, have you been qualified to testify as an expert before in Georgia courts?
I have.
Here in Fulton County?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell the jury a number or range of times?
63 times total.
Okay. And did you examine evidence with respect to this case?
I did.
Correct. And in connection with your examination of the evidence in this case, did you prepare an official report?
I did.
All right. Judge, at this time, I will tender Mr. Zachary Weitzel as an expert in the area of firearm examinations and identifications.
Mr. Harvey, any objection? Mr. Weitzel, you are qualified as an expert for this proceeding in the field of firearm identification and examination.
Okay.
Zach, can you pull the mic close to you? Maybe sit up closer.
Is that better?
Sorry, Zachary Weitzel.
Can I call you Zach too?
When
If
it's
you
your
like.
turn, you can ask him that. No questions from you right now.
Okay. Can you tell the jury what evidence did you receive for testing in this case?
I received a .38 Smith & Wesson revolver, a bullet, a cartridge case, and then 4 cartridges.
Okay. And your official crime lab report, do you have a copy of it?
I do.
With you? If at any time you refer to your report, that's okay. Just let us know both sides, okay?
Okay.
All right. Can you just read into the record what is the unique crime lab number assigned to your report?
It's 2016-102-8446.
Okay. And can you tell the jury when did you receive the evidence for testing?
The evidence was submitted to the laboratory on September 28th, 2016.
And how was it submitted to the lab? Meaning, where did you get it from?
It was brought in by the Atlanta Police Department into our evidence receiving section.
Okay. I'm going to show you several exhibits, Your Honor. They've already been shown to Mr. Harvey. They are sequentially State's Exhibit 386, 494, 495, 496, and I'm also showing Mr. Weitzel States 369. Okay. Can you take a look at all of those exhibits and then tell us whether or not you recognize and can identify them?
Yes, I recognize them. I can identify them based off of my seal, my evidence seal with my initials.
Okay. And that is as to each one of the items that is before you right now?
It's to these two items, State's Exhibit 386 and State's Exhibit 369. State's Exhibit 494 was an interior package to State's Exhibit 369 when I got it, as was State's Exhibit 496, and then State's Exhibit 495 are actually the test fires that I created with State's Exhibit 369.
Okay. And when you say an interior package, tell the jurors what you mean.
I mean that it was inside the gun box here.
When you received it.
Right.
And those items that are contained in those yellow envelopes, you actually removed those items from inside of the gun box when you received it
Right.
and individually packaged it.
Right.
Okay. At this time, Judge, I will tender into evidence State's, does 386 show that it's already admitted, Judge? 386.
No, 369 I have in.
Right.
You may be working on chain of custody things, but 386 is not admitted.
I will tender 386, 494, 495, and 496.
Any objection, Mr. Harvey? They're all admitted.
Okay. Can we start out, Mr. Weitzel, by having you explain to the jury, first of all, the box containing the handgun.
All right.
If you could remove it for the jurors, and with the court's permission, he is mic'd up, Judge. Can he step down?
He may.
Okay. And I'd like to turn you into a sort of a teacher. And if you would, please explain to the jurors what the different parts of that weapon and what happens when you pull the trigger.
Okay. Let me start off by explaining a little bit about ammunition. So when I talk about ammunition, I'm going to refer to it as a cartridge. That's a single unit of live ammunition that hasn't been fired. It consists of a cartridge case, which is a cup with a primer in the bottom, which is going to be the part that creates the spark, gunpowder inside the cup, which burns to create the pressure, and then a bullet that's going to be seated in top of that cartridge case, and that's the part that actually goes down the barrel onto the target. So when I'm referring to the firearm itself, this is a revolver. Revolver indicates that the ammunition is stored in a cylinder here that will rotate up inside the gun, and as the trigger is pulled or the hammer is cocked, the cylinder will rotate the cartridge in line with the barrel. Now, to fire the firearm, the trigger would be pulled or the hammer would be cocked, like so. But with the hammer cocked, it's going to be a single pull of the trigger slightly to the rear that would fire it. With the hammer at rest, you would pull the trigger and it will cock and release the trigger. I refer to this as single action and double action. Single action being it only performs one action. It simply drops the hammer. Double action, it performs two actions. It both cocks and then releases the hammer. So when we refer to firing a revolver, we're going to refer to it in one of two ways. Was it fired single action? Was it fired double action? And that's the explanation for those. Right here is the barrel. And the inside of this will be the lancing grooves that I discussed earlier that impart the spin on the bullet. If you see right here where my thumb is, this is the breech face. This is kind of the back of the gun, and this is the part. This right here, the rear, this is the breech face. It's the part that the cartridge case is, when on recoil, the cartridge case is going to slam up against the back of the gun. The firing pin is the part that strikes the primer, and you can see here that it's just barely barely sticking out the breech face. That's the part that hits the primer, which crushes it, creates the spark. The firing pin is actually attached to the hammer, which is on the rear just above the grip, and it rides inside this shroud, which kind of protects the hammer, prevents it from snagging. And then here you see the front sight and then a rear trench that acts as the rear sight.
Okay. And you described the hammer is contained within a shroud. Can you tell the jurors with respect to this make and model gun, which by the way, if you would share with them what that is?
Okay.
My next question is, what is the significance, if any, of the hammer being contained within that shroud?
Okay. Well, this is Smith & Wesson Model 638, 38 Special. The shroud is designed to kind of protect the hammer to prevent it from snagging. So if you were to pull this out of a pocket or something, that shroud would kind of allow the fabric to ride over the hammer instead of maybe catching on it and preventing it from being drawn. But it also is going to do a couple of things. It's going to protect the hammer if it's dropped. It just kind of hides it, gets it out of the way a little bit for whatever purpose.
Okay. And can you tell the jurors, this weapon in particular, do you have any opinion about whether or not it is designed for self-defense or protection in any way? And explain that to them.
Okay, so this particular model is geared more towards self-defense. The reason being is it's very small. It's got a short barrel, short sight radius, which is going to make pinpoint accuracy more difficult as opposed to a gun that would have a longer barrel and more adjustable sights that would be geared more towards target shooting. So this would be more of a self-defense type gun.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So can you tell the jurors, again, I know you were talking to them when you were showing them the handgun, but in common layman's terms, what is a cartridge?
So the cartridge is the single unit of unfired ammunition. This is the part that if you went to the store to buy ammunition, you would buy a box of cartridges and then you would take them out individually and load them in the gun.
Okay. What's the casing?
The cartridge case is the cup that is left over after you fire the gun. So it's the part that has the primer in the bottom and the gunpowder inside the cup. And then if it was unfired, it would have the bullets seated in top. Once it's fired, the gunpowder burns up and the bullet leaves, and the cartridge case is what's left over.
What is a bullet?
The bullet is the projectile, the part that actually goes down the barrel and out of the gun on towards the target.
Can you open the package that contains, well, like that, let me lay that foundation. Question, better question. When you received the gun, what condition was it in? Meaning, how were all the parts that you removed from the box, how were they in the box? You understand?
The firearm was unloaded, if that's what you mean.
Yes. It was unloaded. And what else?
The cartridges would have been in this envelope right here, and then along with the cartridge case.
Okay. And I want you to open the package that contains the cartridges. And if you would, I'd like you to show the jurors what the cartridges look like that were in that gun. You need some scissors?
I think I can get it.
Okay.
Okay, these are actually my test fires right here.
Okay. We'll talk about that in a second.
These are the cartridges.
Okay. Can you let me have one? And if you could come down, I'd like for you to go before the jury. And if you could just hold it and put it in a position where they can actually physically see it, hold one of them, and just describe for them the different components of the cartridge that we see.
Okay, so here's one up close. This is the cartridge, unfired. The bullet is this little copper portion at the top. The nickel part, that is the cartridge case. And then if I flip that over, see there's a little circle in the bottom there? That's the primer.
Okay. And can you tell the jurors what type ammunition is fired in this gun?
38 special.
And what does 38 special mean?
So that's the caliber designation. 38 indicates the diameter of the bullet. Special is kind of the specific sort of caliber. You put those two together and that tells you the type of ammunition, the caliber that you're supposed to fire in the gun.
Okay. And can you tell the jury how many of those unfired cartridges did you receive as evidence in the case?
4.
And can you tell the jury this 38 special handgun holds as a total capacity how many unfired cartridges?
5.
Okay. Now, the 4 unfired, well, strike that.
Can you sit back down, or do you need?
Yes, you can, yes.
Thanks.
Yeah. The, all of the ammunition that you received for examination in this case, can you tell the jury, was it from the same manufacturer?
No, it wasn't.
Explain that to the jurors.
Well, different manufacturers produce ammunition, and depending on what you buy at the store, you might buy this, one brand of ammunition versus the other, and they might offer different things.
Okay. And can you tell the jurors what brands of ammunition did you find with the evidence you received?
I'm going to double check with my notes real quick,
Okay.
but it was Winchester and Federal.
Can you tell the jury how many Winchester type ammo do we have?
2.
And so how many Federal?
2.
These are unfired.
Correct.
The one that was fired, what was it?
Winchester.
Now, can you tell the jurors, in your opinion, is there a difference between those two manufacturers?
Well, yes, there is a difference. In this particular case, the Winchesters that came with the gun were brass cartridge case, and then the Federal, which is what I was holding a minute ago, that was a nickel cartridge case. Additionally, the Winchesters had what we call a full metal jacket. That means it's a solid bullet. It's lead covered with a thin strip of metal, and then the Federals were jacketed hollow points. Still lead, still with the metal skin, but those have a little hollow cavity that's designed to spread out on impact.
Can I see one of the hollow point unfired cartridges? And can you tell the jury, do you have an opinion with respect to the ability of a jacketed bullet versus a hollow point bullet with respect to how it travels once it strikes an object?
Well, jacketed hollow points are designed to expand on impact, creating a larger hole, basically, but they also won't penetrate as deeply because they have now expanded. Whereas full metal jackets don't have any of those design features, so they stay the same size so long as they don't deform in any way at least, but they'll stay the same size, and then they don't have that expanding capability to slow down faster.
Can you tell the jurors you mentioned to them single versus double action. Did you perform any tests on this firearm to determine, well, strike that. I guess let me ask you a better question. Explain to them what is trigger pull.
The trigger pull is the weight it takes to fire the firearm. So how much force is required to pull the trigger back far enough so that it will fire.
Okay. Did you perform any tests to determine the trigger pull for this particular firearm?
I did.
Okay. Can you tell the jury, as a result of the testing you did, what is your opinion?
So the single action on the gun, simply dropping the hammer when the hammer's already cocked, is 2 1/4 pounds of pressure. And then the double action, both cocking and releasing the hammer, requires 12 1/4 pound to pull the trigger.
Now, can you explain to the jurors how is it that you can determine those numbers, 2 1/4 versus 12 1/4? How is it that you're able to do that?
So I have a spring gauge that basically will measure the force in pounds, and I will hook the front end onto the trigger and then pull to the rear slowly so that it registers the poundage, and then when the hammer falls and the gun would have fired, I read the recording there.
Okay. And I asked you to bring something to court with you, didn't I?
Yes,
You have it with you?
I do.
I actually brought 2 items with you, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Could you explain to the jurors what you had?
All right, so this is the scale that I use. It's a spring gauge. It's similar to how you would weigh your produce at the grocery store. It has a slider here, which would be zeroed, and then it will record the amount of pressure you put on it. So when I'm performing my trigger pulls, I'm going to hook the arm to the trigger and pull to the rear until the hammer falls. And then I just read where the slider is. And I do that a number of times, and then I'll take the average of that.
And can you tell the jurors, when you say for a single action is 2 1/4 pounds, is that like literally if you had a bag of sand or sugar that weighed 2 1/4 pounds?
Right.
And for double action, similarly, 12 1/4, if you had a bag of sand or sugar that was 12 1/4 pounds, that's what we're talking about.
Correct. If you were to hang that weight from the trigger, with the gun pointed up, if you were to hang that weight from the trigger, that's the weight at which the trigger would fall.
And do you see a key contained in that gun box?
Yes.
And you've checked that gun to make sure it is safe, correct?
Correct.
Would the court allow Mr. Weitzel to remove the lock within the firearm and demonstrate for the jurors using the spring gauge 2 1/4 pounds versus 12 1/4 pounds?
I don't have an issue with that, Deputy. The gun appears to be secure. It's got the cord through it. I'm going to allow the witness to remove that, not put any ammo in the weapon, and do what he was going to do. You okay with that?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Your Honor, may I get down so that I'm not pointing the gun?
Please, get in a position, you've got that mobile mic, get in a position that is most secure for everyone involved.
All right, so first of all, you can see daylight through the cylinder. That means there's no ammunition. So when I close it, there's no ammunition in the gun. Now, for single action, I'm going to go ahead and cock the hammer.
And the way you've cocked the hammer, is that what you would consider full cock?
Yes.
Okay.
And then from there, I'm going to place the hook on the trigger, making sure that my hand is not in any way interfering. And I simply pull the rear and then read the recording.
Okay. Now, could you put the gun in full cock and show the jurors how much space is within the trigger guard in between the trigger itself and the outside trigger guard? When it's in full cock.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
I'm going to borrow this note card right here to put behind it. So, can you see the white behind it? Okay, that's the distance that the trigger has left to travel. Now, inside the gun, there's a single action notch on the bottom of the hammer, and then there is a corresponding ledge, so to speak, on the top of the trigger. And this is all happening right up in here. So that interaction is basically something to this effect. So it's a small little area of interaction. When you pull the trigger is going to move forward just a little and slip off, and that's where the hammer is going to fall. So to demonstrate that with the paper, if you can see it, it's just a very slight movement. Were you able to see?
Okay. Now, could you, can we go through the same exercise with the handgun in double action?
Okay.
And maybe if we first start out with, if you would show the jurors the distance, or however you want to do it, it's fine.
Okay. So with double action, you see that the trigger is now set further back. Okay. So from there, I would have to pull the trigger up all the way. So about to there is as far as I can stage it without the hammer falling. But then from this, it's almost the same distance as a single action, but it would have to travel this full distance to fire.
Okay. And if you could show them with the gauge.
So, same thing. Have to hold it to where I'm not interfering with the gauge in any way, but this time I also have to hold it to where I'm not interfering with the cylinder, because as I pull the trigger, that cylinder actually rotates also. You can see that. So, this one, and I would be doing this at a desk with my arm braced. It wouldn't be hanging out in the air here, unstable. But I'm going to pull to the rear until I see that click, at which point, once you get the click, the resistance goes away and the slider stops, and that would be the point at which I would read the gauge.
Okay. You should get situated. And just for the record, you have placed the safety lock back within the handgun?
I have, and the key is still in the lock.
Okay. Can you tell the jury, does this firearm have a safety feature?
Yes, it does.
Could you explain that to them?
So there are two internal safeties with the firearm, and they're both passive safeties, meaning you don't really have to do anything for them to operate. The first one is what's called a hammer block. Now the hammer block is a small little metal lever that goes up through a channel right here, and then over to fall underneath the hammer. The idea is to prevent the hammer from falling all the way and prevent the firing pin from moving through the firing pin channel and touching the cartridge, the primer on the cartridge. Now, this hammer block moves with the trigger. So with the trigger pulled, the hammer block is moved out of the way. So there's nothing, I've got the trigger pulled right now, so there's nothing hindering the hammer at this moment because it's been moved out of the way. Now if I release the trigger, the hammer block is pushed up in between the hammer and the frame. So that's the first safety. The second safety is really part of the lock work in the Smith & Wesson, and it's called a rebounding slide. Now, it serves two functions in terms of pulling the trigger and how that works, and that is it rebounds the trigger and hammer. So when you pull the trigger, the hammer falls all the way forward and the trigger is back. What you're doing is you're compressing a spring and pushing this rebound slide out of the way, which it's essentially a big block of steel inside the gun. When you pull the trigger, that moves out of the way. When you release the trigger, it pushes back, it provides the spring tension for returning the hammer and the trigger to their normal position, but as it moves back in, it actually creates a metal-on-metal connection between the hammer and the rebounding slide. So with it moved back into place and the trigger not being pulled, it's actually locking up the hammer so that it can't move.
Did you perform some tests on this firearm to determine whether or not it functions as designed by the manufacturer?
I did.
Can you explain that to the jurors?
So with this particular firearm, I performed the trigger pulls. After that, I actually removed the metal side plate right here to take a look at the inside. And then from there, I can determine that, yes, the hammer block is present. It's still pinned to the trigger. And yes, the rebounding slide is present and didn't appear, or I'm going to refer to my notes real quick.
Yes, sir.
And I actually was able to count the spring that falls within the rebounding slide to make sure that there hadn't been any modifications there. And it did have the correct number of coils for the manufacturer.
Okay. And so what is your opinion with respect to how this gun functions?
That it functions as designed.
It functions as designed.
Yeah.
Can you tell the jury this firearm, if I just hold it in my hands like this, will it just go off?
No.
If I sit down with it and hold it down here in my lap, will it just go off?
No.
If I handle it like this in any way, will it just go off?
No.
What will make this firearm go off?
Something would have to act on the trigger.
And when you say something has to act on the trigger, what do you mean?
I mean, the trigger has to be pulled rearward.
Can you tell the jury what is recoil?
So recoil is what a lot of people refer to as the kick of the gun. When the gun fires, the gunpowder burns, and the bullet and the gas from the cartridge both exit the barrel. Well, that creates a force to the rear, and that's what people refer to as the kick, and that's the recoil, where the gun moves in your hand.
Okay. So, you know, like sometimes if you watch the old Dirty Harry movies with the real big gun that he has, and he's, you know, boom, and you see his arm go back, that's what you're talking about?
Right.
Okay.
Do I get to get in a movie reference?
Again, no questions till it's your turn.
I'm asking you.
No questions to me either, just
I'll
objections.
object.
Okay, objection to movie reference, overruled.
Okay.
There's a form of the question, not the form of the movie reference.
You don't like that?
It was the form of the question, but you can move on.
Okay. Do you have any opinion with respect to the recoil for this gun?
Well, this is a lightweight gun with a short barrel, so that tends to have more recoil than a heavier gun with a longer barrel.
Okay. More recoil.
Yes.
So, would you have any opinion of what you would expect to see with respect to recoil on this gun if it were fired in a lower position like here in your lap?
So could I make an objection
Sure.
Okay. Let's look at the casing. Okay. And can you tell the jury, when you, actually, why don't you show it to them? Can you show the jurors, what is that indentation on the bottom of the casing?
Right, so in the circle, in the bottom of the cartridge case, there's a little impression there. See it?
You
That,
can walk around to the side so the folks up the top.
good? So this is the impression that the firing pin makes when the hammer falls forward and strikes that primer.
Okay. And can you tell the jury, is on some occasions, is there a way to test that indentation so that you can determine whether or not the weapon was fired in either single action or double action?
Oh, no.
No. Okay. Okay. And let's talk about the bullet. Could you remove it from its packaging and show it to, actually hand it to me. If you remove from the packaging. And can you tell the jury, the testing that you did with respect to this evidence, what are your opinions or conclusions with respect to this bullet?
That bullet was fired in the Firearm State's Exhibit 369.
Do you also have an opinion with respect to the casing?
No, the cartridge case wasn't examined because it was indicated to have been fired from the cylinder, so I didn't actually do a microscopic comparison there.
Okay. Can you tell the jury what is a ricochet?
A ricochet is where the bullet will strike a surface and then bounce off of that surface.
And with respect to the density or the hardness of these bullets that are at issue here, or bullets like them, what kind of surface are we talking about that you would expect to cause a ricochet?
Well, I will say that bullets can do strange things. So anytime you're talking about what a bullet will do, that's kind of dangerous territory, but hard surface, you would be concerned with ricochets.
Could you give the jury an example of what you consider to be a hard surface?
I would say that's subjective. Like I say, trying to predict what a bullet would do is a dangerous conversation. It's not really something I'm trained in. So
Okay.
I don't really want to venture into that.
I understand. The bullet that you examined in this case, was it deformed in any way?
No.
And explain what you mean by when you say it was not deformed.
So when bullets hit, sometimes they're damaged. Sometimes they stay in the same general shape that they came from the factory. But sometimes they'll hit a surface and they'll flatten out, or they'll hit a surface and they'll fragment. This one wasn't like that.
The does your experience and training allow you to comment on gunshot residue?
No.
Okay. Can you tell the jury what is a muzzle target test?
Okay, muzzle target distance determination is where if an item has been shot, clothing, something to that effect, the gunpowder and residues from the cartridge will end up on the clothing of the target or whatever. You basically have four things leaving the barrel. You have the bullet itself, you have unburnt gunpowder, burnt gunpowder, and vaporous lead. When we do a muzzle target distance determination, what we're doing is we're examining the defect, the hole from the bullet. We're examining the unburnt gunpowder, burnt, and then the residue, and we do that through a series of visual and then chemical tests to kind of develop a pattern. From there, we can take the gun and take the same ammunition and fire it at various distances to reproduce that pattern. And that's essentially a muzzle to target distance test.
Okay. And the muzzle to target distance test, if performed, will allow you to reach what conclusion?
We report in a range, so we wouldn't say that it was X number of inches. We would say it was between X and Y inches.
Like in between 1 and 4 inches?
That's somewhat of a narrow range, but yeah,
1 to 6 inches?
sure.
Okay. And can you tell the jury, were you asked by the Atlanta Police Department to perform a muzzle target distance determination test with respect to the items you received and, say, the vehicle at issue in this case?
So I was asked to perform it on the seat of the vehicle.
By whom?
I believe Atlanta Police Department.
And did you?
No.
Why not?
Well, as I said earlier, we report a range. So within a car, there's already a range. There's a maximum distance already. But more importantly, the gun was reported to have been inside a bag. Well, that becomes an intermediate object. So that's something that both the bullet and the gunpowder and the vaporous lead and the burnt gunpowder all have to pass through. So were I to do that test, it wouldn't have been an accurate representation because when this firearm was fired, it was reported to have been in a bag. So that it kind of throws my test off.
Do you have in your records the date you were asked to perform the test?
Let me refer to my notes again. So,
You can keep going.
I'm sorry,
Someone
yes.
starts fussing.
okay.
Yes, go ahead.
So the earliest email I have is actually not to me, it's to my manager, and that was December 30th of 2016. Now that's not to say that that's the date, that's just what I have in front of me.
Is there anything about that firearm, if it were fired on the inside of a plastic grocery bag, that would affect the normal mechanical workings of the gun?
So the bag should not hinder the operation of the gun, if that's your question.
Yes.
Do you have any sense from your expertise what would happen to the bag if in fact it were around the gun when the gun was fired? Presumably the bullet would go through it, but what, if anything else, would happen with the bag?
Anything I would tell you would just be an assumption.
Okay.
And strike that. Can that firearm be fired if it is inside the bag and the person's hand is inside the bag, it can be fired.
Right.
If you pull the trigger.
It could.
Could it also be fired if the gun is in the bag and the person's hand is on the outside of the bag?
Sure.
Okay. Did you receive a holster in this case?
Not for analysis.
Okay. But did you take a look at it?
I have seen an image of it,
Okay.
but I haven't examined it.
Okay. But you never physically had the holster itself?
I've had it in my custody, but not for analysis.
Okay. I'm just trying to determine whether or not you actually put your eyes on it.
Physically on the holster, I don't believe so.
Okay. So you, okay. You don't know if that holster then goes to that gun?
No.
Okay. I want to show you two exhibits. I seek to just introduce, Your Honor, Mr. Weitzel's reports to be made a part of the record to travel with the case. They're not to be go out with the jurors.
Understood. What numbers?
267 is the report that deals with the working condition and the trigger pull.
Got it?
498 deals with the bullet being fired from the firearm.
Mr. Harvey, any objection to 267 and 498 being made part of the record? Same caveats apply. Admitted as part of the record.
Okay. And I just, for the record, want Mr. Weitzel just take a look at it, make sure that he can confirm these are actually his reports, or copies thereof.
Yes, they are.
Okay. Okay. So we discussed all the evidence that you received and performed examinations on, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And with respect to the work that you did in this case, is that pretty much concluded?
Yes.
Okay. Just so they don't get lost, you want to repackage those cartridges?
While he's doing that, for you, my notes aren't clear on this. 494 and 495 are both been admitted. What are those?
I'm sorry. Would you describe those for the jury?
Okay, yeah, I think there might have been a mix-up here. 495 is the unfired ammunition that was submitted with the gun. 494 are the test fires that I created using the gun.
Okay. Thank you.
What are test fires?
Test fires are when I get a gun, in order to do a microscopic analysis and also to make sure the gun functions correctly, I have to shoot it. So I will take ammunition of the same design as my evidence, and I'll fire at least 3 shots through it. I'll collect the bullets and the cartridge cases and use those for my microscopic comparison. So the test fires are those.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. That's all my questions.
Okay. Mr. Harvey.
Afternoon, how are you?
Good afternoon.
If you can't hear me or my throat goes froggy, which it sounds like it already is, let me know, okay?
Okay.
All right. And with your kind permission, Mr. Walker.
We can't afford them.
Back in September of 2016, you received some items that you've told us about, correct?
Correct.
You received a Smith & Wesson 38, the 38 that you've talked to us about, correct?
Correct.
That's a Smith & Wesson revolver, correct?
Right.
it's a 5-shot revolver.
Yes.
It's what's called an air weight,
Right.
and it's what, a 638 plus P?
Yes.
You know, so S&W 638.
Well, so the numerical designation, the Smith & Wesson designation is 638-3, but the caliber for the gun is what?
Yeah, that's,
So you can fire plus P ammunition in it.
and I'll ask you about that. I just want to identify it. And it's called an air weight, right?
Right.
It's called an air weight primarily because it's light, right?
Right, so it's an alloy frame instead of being solid steel to try to cut weight to make it lighter.
And can you tell us how much the air weight weighs?
I can look in my notes. It's 0.95 pounds.
So it doesn't even weigh a pound.
0.95 pound.
Wait, who missed that?
The court reporter, she got it now. We're good.
You got it? I could have told you. So it's an air weight because it is light, correct?
Right,
It is small, correct?
right.
So it's, how long is the barrel?
It's just under 2 inches.
Less than 2 inches. Is that less than? Is that greater than?
Less than.
And it is a 5-shot.
Correct.
Revolver, correct?
Correct.
I think you told us that it is, I think I wrote it down, it is primarily a revolver that is used for self-defense, correct?
Right.
And it's used for, would you say, and have you said previously, that it is a typical gun that a person could buy to protect themselves, right?
Right, it is a common firearm.
It's very small. That's kind of the reason it's small, so it can be carried. It can be carried and used by the average person, correct?
Right.
And it can be carried in different places like pocketbooks, pockets, in other places without it being heavy, correct?
Right.
Because of the shrouded hammer, it doesn't get caught on clothes and perhaps involuntarily or accidentally discharged, correct?
Right.
Okay. So that an average person could carry that, correct?
Right.
You don't have to be a big person, male or female, can carry that and use it with reasonable ease, correct?
Sure.
Likewise, you don't have to be a bodybuilder or a muscle person to be able to use the weapon and use it for self-defense. That's its whole purpose, correct?
Sure. Yeah.
Young people can use it. Is it, you got to say yes or no?
Yeah, if they want to.
I get it. We're not here to make those debates. We're not debating. We're talking about its physicality. When was the first time that you shot a gun?
5-ish.
5-ish.
Now we know why he has this job.
And by the way, you shot thousands and thousands and thousands of rounds, haven't you?
Yes.
So that a weapon like this airway can be used by someone, a young person, a kid, really, correct?
Sure.
Okay. And I also understood that, and you've told the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that there's a difference between single action and double action. In single action, the tree, you pull the hammer back, correct?
Right,
It stays there, correct?
right,
It's a shorter trigger pull distance, as you've shown us, correct?
yes,
So it takes much less pressure in order to discharge it, correct?
correct.
But it is still a single movement.
Yeah,
There is a single action of the weapon, but it's just a single pull of the trigger that would discharge it when we're talking about.
right,
Double action is still a single trigger pull, but there are two mechanical actions. Am I correct about that?
exactly. The double action is referring to the firearm, not the actual pull of the trigger.
So it's not like you have to pull the trigger twice or that there's something inhibiting it. It's still a single trigger pull, correct?
Right, single trigger pull.
Okay. And when you received this weapon, I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit number 123. Is that? Okay. It's not in focus up here. Is that in focus? That's the way you received it, correct?
No, the firearm had been unloaded when I got it.
Okay. But you understood that this is the way, was taken at the scene, as it were, when the weapon was seized, that this is the way the weapon was loaded.
Not this specifically, but that when it was recovered, the cartridge case and then the cartridges were in the cylinder.
Okay. In that particular rotation.
No, I didn't have that information.
Okay. Do you have any reason to believe that State's Exhibit 123 taken by the crime scene technician who seized the weapon would have rotated it in a different rotation?
Meaning what exactly?
Have it manipulated the cylinder in any way to show that it was in a different order than this?
Are you referring to the cartridges being put in that order in the cylinder or the cylinder's physical rotation in the gun?
Good question, I'll give you that.
That's pretty rare. I'm going to say, I answered the question.
Well, that's because it's, you know. If you release the cylinder, can you just spin the cylinder?
Yes. If this were in the gun, I would depress the cylinder release and it would swing out, but this cylinder has the ability to rotate.
Right. But if let's presume that crime scene technicians want to accurately reflect the weapon at the time they seized it, correct?
Okay.
One of the things that you wouldn't do is open it up and spin the old cylinder and then say, okay, I think I'll take a photograph of what's inside the cylinder when the spinning stops. What was the name of that show? We did the big circle.
So like movies, we won't get into TV.
Well, I got them across. Presumably, it would reflect the position of the cartridges in the cylinder, correct?
Right. If you wanted to know where the cartridges lined up in the gun, when you opened it up, you should have been careful to not rotate the cylinder.
You've got the Winchester 38 Specialist, right?
Right.
I'm just going to put 38. The Winchester 38s, and they are FMJs,
Correct.
right? Which I think you've told us means full metal jacket, right?
Right.
And the Federals, which are the silver ones, the Federal 38s, they are called Hydroshocks.
Okay, that's Federal's brand name for them.
Okay, well, maybe I missed it, but that's what I said. These are Federal 38s.
Right, generically they would be jacketed hollow points, but Federal's specific name for that particular line of ammunition within their selection is Hydroshock.
But they're hollow points.
Correct.
And I understand hollow points are a 38 special hollow point is specifically designed to expand on contact, correct?
Correct.
And the idea there is to, I guess, create a wider path for the bullet, correct?
Right.
And to do more damage if damage is going to be done.
Correct. The idea behind the expansion is to put as much energy into the target as possible, because if the bullet passes straight through, then the energy required for it to go straight through is wasted. So with hollow points, they expand to a greater diameter, so you have a bigger hole, and then they are designed to hopefully stop when they hit instead of traveling all the way through.
So if you're contemplating trying to do damage to someone, a hollow point is what you use, correct?
Hollow points are marketed for self-defense, whereas full metal jackets are more for target.
Right. A full metal jacket is a target unit. A hollow point is a self-defense unit, essentially, correct?
Right.
And in that regard, they have different types of physical capacities, not just what happens when it goes through something, but they're different weights, correct?
Right.
A 38 special, you know, and the one that you measured is 130 grains.
Right.
Okay? That's the content of that second part of what's inside the cartridge casing, right?
It's the weight of the actual projectile.
Okay.
So the weight of the Winchester bullet, the State's Exhibit 386, was 130 grains. To put that in perspective, there are 7,000 grains in a pound.
And the Hydroshock, I'm going to say, the Hydroshock, that's 110 grains.
Let me see. I don't actually have that with me, but that is a weight that Hydroshock would come in.
Likewise, there are different, tell us what muzzle velocity is.
Muzzle velocity is the speed of the bullet when it leaves the barrel.
And the Winchester FMJ, full metal jacket, has got a, would you disagree with me, that they advertise it and they say that it's got an 800 muzzle velocity.
Right. That's going to be an estimate. It's going to depend on the gun and the barrel length and things like that. But right, same ballpark.
And the Hydroshock has got a 980 muzzle velocity.
That sounds correct.
Right. So it's both more damaging and it's faster.
Right.
Right? I guess one of the first things that you want to do or that you did, was when you receive the weapon, is to check it out physically. You identified it, right?
Right.
You weighed it, you measured it, You described it, correct?
Correct.
You then told us a little bit about the trigger pull that you did.
Right.
Right. And I know you told us, but you do more than one test, correct?
Right.
You do, what, 10 tests? You do it 10 times?
10 of the trigger pull measurements, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
So you've got a range because every time you pull the trigger, it doesn't pull the same, even on the same gun.
Right.
Okay? So the range that you had for the trigger pull on this particular weapon was anywhere from 2 pounds, correct?
Let me confirm that. Right.
2 pounds to 2.5 pounds.
That's correct.
And there were 3 trigger pulls, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 trigger pulls that were at 2 pounds, at 12 pounds, correct?
You said 4?
I'm sorry. With regard to the trigger pull in single action,
Okay.
you do 10, and in single action it went from a low of 2 to a high of 2.5, correct?
Right.
And there were 1, 2, 3, 4 of the trigger pulls were at 2, correct?
Right.
2 of them were at 2.5.
Yes.
But it was the average that got you to 2.25.
Right. The reported values are the average of those 10 pulls.
Okay. Same thing with the double action trigger
Right.
pull. You do 10 trigger pulls, correct?
Right.
And you have everything, the range that you had was 11.75 pounds, correct?
Right.
To something at 12.75.
Correct.
All right, you had a high and a low.
Right.
It's not the mean you're looking for, it's the average, so you don't throw out the high and the low, you just combine them and divide by 10.
Right.
Okay. But it could be low as 11.75, could be as high as 12.75, correct?
That's correct.
All right. So we know that those are ranges and it's different every time, correct?
Right.
All right. We also know that folks can, if folks can modify their own guns, and they often do. You told us about the internal safeties and the springs that are inside the weapon.
Right.
Sometimes folks take apart their weapons and modify their weapons in order to change the spring tension in other components, correct?
Right. That can be done.
To lessen, to make lower the trigger pull components.
Right.
We've heard of stuff called a hair trigger
Yes.
in common parlance, right? And sometimes there are weapons that have lower trigger pulls, but they can be self-modified. You can modify the trigger pull on a weapon like this revolver.
Right. You could.
This one wasn't modified in any fashion.
I didn't see any evidence that it was.
Okay, well, but I'm just saying, you looked for it.
Right.
Right. So this wasn't modified at all either. You told us also a little bit about what happens when a weapon is discharged or shot, fired, right?
Right.
And I'll show you what's been marked as Defendant's Exhibit number 12. And on Defendant's Exhibit number 12, that shows not this particular weapon firing, but a revolver firing, correct?
Right.
And we understand that there are primer residue and other types of items that are discharged from a weapon when it's fired, a revolver.
Right.
There can be cylinder gap discharge, correct?
Right.
There can be, and there frequently is, um, gunshot residue and other items that come out of the muzzle of the gun when it's fired, correct?
Right.
And one of the reasons why a bullet or projectile is propelled out is because there is essentially an explosion, correct?
It's a burn. It's not an explosion, but if you want to visualize it as an explosion, yeah, the gunpowder burns very, very quickly and creates such extreme pressures that the bullet is propelled out of the barrel.
And it's very, very hot.
Right.
When it comes out of the muzzle, like you can see on Defendant's Exhibit number 12, it almost looks like it's on fire, correct?
Right, yeah, you're referring to the flash, the muzzle
Yes.
flash?
Yes.
Yeah.
And tell us, muzzle flash, tell us what that means.
Okay, so the muzzle flash is what you're seeing here. It's the particles of gunpowder that haven't burned up yet, they're burning up. So it's going to look like sparks or fire coming out the front of the barrel.
And it's hot when it comes out.
Right.
And it comes out with tremendous force, correct?
Yes.
And we talked about the muzzle velocities, correct?
Right.
And when we talk about the muzzle velocity, how is that expressed when we said 800 muzzle velocity? Is that 800
It's usually feet per second.
feet per second propelled by something that is extremely hot and a projectile that goes out?
Right.
We can see sort of the plume of vapor, it looks like. Tell us what that is. What does that contain?
So within that cloud there, those are going to be the three components I was discussing earlier with the muzzle target. Vaporous lead, burnt gunpowder, and unburnt gunpowder. And then of course, the smoke and soot from that. The soot is really the burnt gunpowder, but that's what you're looking at there.
And that can get deposited, the vaporous lead, on a number of surfaces, correct?
Yes.
And it does not have to be a particular type of surface for it to be deposited on that surface, correct? I mean, it can,
I'm sorry, what?
maybe I'm going to ask a better question. It can be deposited on clothes.
Yes,
It can be deposited, frankly, it can be deposited on skin.
it can.
It can be deposited on wood, carpet, car seats, or whatever.
Right, anything in front of the gun.
Anything in front of the gun. Now, there may be something between the gun and the deposits, but that doesn't change the fact that there would be deposits, correct?
Well, so long as those residues could make it through the intermediate object, then they could be deposited. If they are stopped by the intermediate object, then they wouldn't.
And some intermediate objects are more likely to stop the discharge of the vapor than others, correct?
Right.
Like a Publix bag or a Kleenex
Right.
or a sticky Post-it
Yes.
or a brick.
Right, that would be hugely different.
Okay. And one of the things that you do in your job, is to make estimations of muzzle to target distance, correct?
Right.
And the deposits on a particular substance are very often useful in making a determination between muzzle and target distance, correct?
Right.
That's usually accomplished by visualizing a gunshot residue pattern, correct?
Right. It's visualized through the use of chemical tests, but it's still a visualization of the pattern.
Well, one of the first things that you would do around a defect or around something in clothing or a whiteboard or whatever might be, is to see if, in fact, there was a pattern.
Right, yeah, the initial process in a muzzle to target test is going to be to actually use a stereo microscope, which is, it's essentially serves the same purpose as a magnifying glass, but kind of in microscope form, and you would have your piece of evidence below that, and you would move it around, and you actually visualize, is there gunpowder deposits on there, and if so, you're going to document whether or not you've got a pattern there.
Okay, well, that's for something you can bring into the lab and perhaps put under the microscope. You and crime scene techs and others, you can perform the same kind of analysis on objects that aren't in the laboratory, that are out in the field, correct?
For what I do, I would need it in the laboratory. Now, that's not to say that the test couldn't be performed under different circumstances, but for me, it would need to be in the laboratory.
Sure, so someone who sees what potentially might be a gunshot residue pattern can do a number of things with that, correct?
Sure, yeah.
It can be measured, correct?
Right,
It can be photographed, correct? It can be preserved, correct?
right.
You can test it by means of, for example, stubs. You know what stubs are?
How, what context?
Well, stubs in order to take a sample of what might be on the object that's not in the laboratory,
Okay.
and can be taken back to the laboratory and tested, correct?
It would depend on what you're testing for.
Okay, that's fine. You're testing for well, you're looking for patterns though, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the patterns include all the effluent, the soot, the partially burnt gunpowder, the primer residues, not just primer residues, correct?
Primer residues is GSR in terms of, from the trace evidence perspective. When I refer to gunshot residue, what I'm referring to is burnt, unburnt gunpowder and vaporous lead.
And does that include nitrates?
Well, yes, the gunpowder itself is nitrate.
But nobody
Okay.
said the word nitrate yet. And then there are tests that, there are ways of visualizing a gunshot residue pattern using chemicals to make the pattern more evident.
Right, that's how we visualize the pattern, is through chemical testing.
Okay. And that could be done, correct?
Right.
I understand that perhaps you were asked about a pattern like that, but declined to actually, not decline, your division did not perform any pattern analysis on the vehicle in this particular case, correct?
No.
You were asked to perform it, but you didn't perform it? Is that what I'm...
It was asked, not directly to me, but it was asked and denied.
Okay. Were you ever asked to examine any clothes that Mr. McIver may have had on or didn't have on?
Myself, personally, no.
Even if a gun might be in a Publix plastic bag, there's still cylinder gap and there's still gases exploding from the weapon, correct?
Right.
And if those gases and gunshot residue penetrated the little Publix bag, and if the weapon was on his lap, there could have been gunshot residue deposited on his pants, correct?
Sure.
Okay. So, I guess to your knowledge, is based upon your Division of Forensic Sciences, no muzzle to target test was performed using the weapon that we had here, correct?
No, it wasn't.
Okay, also I understand that you actually test fired the gun, right?
Yes.
You test fired the gun because you wanted to compare the gun with the cartridge, with the bullet that you got, correct?
Right.
So you had the ability to test fire, and what you do is you fire it into a big tub of water because it slows it down and it stops it and it doesn't make any marks on it so that you can make the comparison, correct?
Right. We have a horizontal water tank with a lid that opens up in a port, and we fire it into the water tank. The bullet loses velocity, falls to the bottom, and then we just collect it from the bottom.
Right, and that's so you can perform those tests in-house and it doesn't damage the projectile.
Right.
Likewise, you also have the ability to perform muzzle to target tests, correct?
Yes.
And what you do in muzzle to target tests is you take the same weapon, right?
Yes.
You use the same ammunition, correct?
Right.
And you fire it at varying distances into something like a white sheet, for example.
Right. A piece of cloth.
Okay. And so at varying distances, you can tell the pattern that weapon, given the same type of ammunition, projects, correct?
Right.
Right. You could do that you could have done that with this weapon. Could have put it inside a Publix bag and shot it.
That could be done, but it wouldn't have been a validated method, meaning it's not something we have researched to determine what kind of variables are going to affect it. We know it's going to affect it, but we don't know exactly how much it's going to affect it.
Okay, so the answer is you don't know how much it's going to affect it, correct?
Right.
All right. Just like you don't know whether the weapon, this particular weapon was fired single action or double action, because there's no way to tell, is there, how a weapon was fired, correct?
That's correct.
There's no way to tell, especially if something is inside a bag at night, whether it's already in single action or double action, correct?
Right. There's not a test for me for that.
Okay. And there's not a test to determine whether it was fired in single action or double action, correct?
Right.
And the weapon was not, you said, malfunctioning. We know that.
Right.
So you're telling us that there was manipulation of the trigger, correct?
Right.
Do you know what that was?
No.
All right. If it's in single action, I think you said that if it's in single action, if you put it in your pocket, even keys, it may hit some keys in your pocket and go off. The trigger pull is so light, correct?
Right.
And if you have the weapon and you don't know whether it's in single action or double action, it's extremely easy for that weapon to go off. Even things like keys in your pocket can unintentionally discharge the weapon, correct?
Right. So any force that exerts that amount of pressure, and our average was 2 1/4 pounds. So anything that can exert that amount of force can pull the trigger.
And there's no scientific test or test that you can do to tell us whether or not the trigger was intentionally or unintentionally pulled, correct?
No.
Okay.
Mr. Rutter, any redirect? Bless you.
Let's see. With respect to performing a muzzle target distance test, you didn't do it in this case. For what reason?
Well, because of the intermediate object, that will affect it, and we don't have a validated method to determine how much that affects it. And if we can't scientifically validate a test, it's not something we're going to do.
Okay. How many cases in your career have you had where the firearm was fired inside of a Publix plastic bag?
None that I know of.
Do you have firearms yourself?
Yes.
Do you carry any of your firearms in a plastic Publix grocery bag?
Yeah, whether he does or not, it's irrelevant.
It's all right?
Sort of like what age you first fired a gun, but you didn't.
Right,
Jack.
I didn't. It's okay. And in addition, for muzzle to target distance testing, if the comparison you do is to the object where the bullet went through.
Right.
So in this case, it would be the back of the seat.
Right.
And then you go into the lab and then you perform a test up against a sheet to see what the pattern looks like. You can do a comparison and you can say within a range, the example I used earlier was 1 to 6 inches. You can tell within that range, that's how far the muzzle of the gun was to the target.
Right.
Okay. And if the seat had been cleaned prior to your receipt of it, would the wiping of the back of the seat affect the pattern that you would look at?
Yes, it would.
How so?
But it wouldn't erase everything completely. If the firearm is close enough, there will be particles actually embedded into the material. But anything loose or just resting on the surface would be wiped off. An easy way to think of it is if you took a handful of glitter and threw it, but you're throwing it at 800 feet per second. That's the difference. But some's going to have enough velocity to kind of embed, and some is just going to kind of flutter and land on it, and those can be wiped off.
Okay. I want to ask you about a term you used, Mr. Harvey, hair trigger.
Yes.
Define that for the jurors.
A hair trigger is kind of a slang term that refers to a trigger that is really light.
Okay. What is the trigger pull, the force that's needed for a head trigger?
Well, again, it's not really an official term that we use, but when we refer to it, it's usually less than a pound.
Less than 1 pound.
Right.
I wanted to ask you about this photo here. Can you tell the jurors, and this is Stage 123, when the trigger is pulled, can you tell the jurors which way does the cylinder rotate?
It's going to rotate to the left.
To the left. So in this example, could you identify for the jurors by touching the screen which one of these cartridges has been fired? You can touch the screen in front of you.
Right here.
Okay. And so if you pull the trigger a second time, could you indicate on the screen which cartridge would next rise up into the chamber?
Presuming that that's the same orientation that's in the gun, this one.
Okay. And the silver one, is that the one that you talked to Mr. Harvey about that said that's kind of the hollow points?
Yes, that would be the jacketed hollow point.
Those are the ones that are designed when they go into something, they stop.
Right.
He asked you, they do maximum damage.
Right.
Okay. And they're faster.
Generally.
Okay. But is it true that they're designed to stop?
Right. That's one of the characteristics.
Right. And so the other full metal jacket, the ones that are kind of brass or gold color, they're designed to go through.
I wouldn't say they're specifically designed to go through, but that is one thing that they do.
Right. So hypothetically, if you have like a plastic piece that's in the middle of the seat, That full metal jacketed one, the gold and brass one, it's not designed to hit the plastic and break apart. It's designed to kind of go through. Is that fair?
Right. I mean, all things being equal, the full metal jacket will penetrate more than the jacketed hollow point.
Right. The explosion that you talked to Mr. Harvey about, and we saw on this photograph here, he called this like a plume, but is it fair to say that you could also call that like a puff of smoke?
Sure.
And would that be visible to the naked eye?
Well, this photo would have been captured with a high-speed photograph. In normal conditions, you may or may not actually see this, but you would probably see some sort of flash that's very quick.
Okay. And I guess, yes, a better question. So with that gun, you've test fired it, correct?
Yes.
If we're in an enclosed space, like a car, and you pull the trigger on that gun right there, you get the plume or the puff of smoke, even though that photo is captured with a high-speed camera, my question to you is, with your naked eye, would you see like a puff of smoke?
Possibly. But when I test fired in a tank, which actually has negative pressure to contain the smoke and the soot and stuff to prevent, high levels of lead. But in the absence of that, yes, any time you discharge a firearm or anytime anything burns, there should be, smoke residue.
Okay. And very quickly, she states 126. Let me ask you a question. The fact that the seat pocket right here is pulled out some distance, would that...
This is beyond the scope of cross.
And this is as the muzzle target distance determination.
I'll let you finish the question.
Okay.
And I'll decide.
Okay. The fact that the seat pocket right here is pulled out, with respect to any muzzle to target determination test that you would have done, with the fact that the seat pocket is pulled out, would that have affected any result?
Okay, don't answer yet. Overruled. Now you can answer.
Okay. Potentially. The answer is that as everything leaves the barrel, the greater the distance it travels, the bigger that pattern is going to be. So if that pocket interferes with those gunshot residues reaching the back of the seat, then essentially what you would have is part of the pattern being on the pocket and then maybe a different pattern because it's further away being on the seat.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Juror questions? Weitzel, do you know how much heat is generated from the vapors? We've had that picture up for a while with the cloud and the flame coming out of the gun. Any sense of what that temperature range might be of what's coming out of there?
No, I don't.
Do the safety features on what's the exhibit number for the gun?
369.
369. Do the safety features for the gun in Exhibit 369 change in any way when the gun is single action versus double action mode?
So the safety features are designed to function with the trigger. So with the trigger pulled, the safety features don't work because they're designed not to work in that case. If the gun is in a single action, so with the hammer cocked, it's primed, it's ready to be fired. The only way that the gun will fire is if the trigger is pulled and then held to the rear long enough for the hammer to fall. So if you were to pull the trigger, but then release the trigger, and I'll put my finger here so that I could feel it if it went through, it doesn't touch, because you notice the trigger actually moves forward with the hammer if I don't physically depress it. So the safeties still apply.
Do you know how much pull pressure it would take to full cock the hammer?
I don't.
Is the hammer block still active when the gun is fully cocked?
It's still active so long as the trigger is not being pulled. So, like I said earlier, if the trigger is pulled, everything's out of the way. Everything is intentionally out of the way so that the gun can fire. But when the trigger is released, everything moves back into place. And I should note on the previous question, it was how much force is required to pull the hammer back. There's a spring right here that is actually what keeps, it's the spring that the hammer is working off of. So that's the tension that the hammer works off of. So when you pull the trigger, you're compressing that spring with your finger, but you're also rotating the cylinder. So it will be a little different than just simply the trigger pull weight. But if you were to pull the hammer back just simply by hand, you're still compressing that spring. You're just going about it a different way, but with less other factors to worry about. Does that make sense?
Can you share with the jury an example of what could discharge a firearm, pull the trigger in single action mode, other than someone putting their finger on it? In other words, what would generate the 2 1/4 pounds average figure you calculate?
Well,
Make sense?
I think so. Something has to act on the trigger with sufficient force to release that connection. And I use my fingernails because that's close to the surface area that we're talking about. Now, if you were to, let's say, force the hammer forward, you break the metal there, and then it won't catch. So if that were to happen, then I could push on it, and we call it that push off, and that's actually something that I tested for when I had the gun, was can I, with my thumb, and my thumb alone, push the hammer forward, and I can't. And because I can't do that, that means it hasn't sustained that damage to that small area. So for this gun, you have to exert that amount of force on the trigger to allow the clearance for the hammer to slip off.
Mr. Rucker, any follow-up for Mr. Weitzel based on those questions?
Yes, you, Judge. You can't tell the jurors how much force it takes to pull the hammer back?
No, not exactly.
Okay. Can you just explain to them why not?
Because, now, can I take the lock off?
Sure. Well, I'm sorry, let me make sure. The other deputy who was here green lighted it. We've had a change in personnel.
Yeah. So, can I get up?
Pardon?
Can I get up?
Please, yeah. Okay.
Okay, so as I pull the trigger here, if you see there's a small piece right here. See that? There's a
Just
little
come
piece
all
in
the
the
way down
slot.
the rail and go up to the back so everybody can see it.
Yeah, I'm going to move. There's a little, it's called the hand. And it rides in a little slot right here, and it moves with the trigger. And as you pull the trigger double action, are y'all able to see that? There's any, it's hard to see, it's small. But as you pull the trigger, what it's doing is it's pushing up on these little ratchets and rotating the cylinder like this. So when you're pulling double action, you're doing two things. You're compressing the spring in the grip, which cocks the hammer, but it's also rotating the cylinder, which is part of the reason for the variation in the actual measured weights shot to shot when you're doing a double action trigger pull measurement, because each one of those ratchets, depending on how it's cut, has a potential different trigger pull value. So that's the extra step that is happening when you pull the trigger double action versus when you just do this. Now you're still doing it, it's still rotating the cylinder, but the leverage is different. So for me to say, well, this is the amount of force that it takes to pull the hammer back, I can't say that that's anything more than an estimate.
I noticed that when you were trying to pull the trigger with the gun in double action, your hand was shaking.
Yes.
Why is that?
Because that's a relatively heavy trigger pull, and especially...
Hold on. That's not a follow-up. It's not a follow-up, and I object to that question. And no, you didn't.
Yeah.
Can we approach?
In a minute, I'm just thinking through. So you can approach, I'm going to allow that question, but if you want to approach.
Did you understand my question?
Repeat it for me.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Was your hand shaking when you were attempting to pull the trigger with that firearm in double action?
Yes, a little bit.
Why?
Well, it's 12.25 pounds, and I'm doing it with my fingers, so for that, that's a relatively heavy poundage for your trigger. Now, I should clarify that doing it quickly is doable. It's much more difficult to show you guys to do it slower, but it's designed to be heavier than the single action.
Is 12.25 pounds normal?
Yes.
For the average gun?
It's normal for the double action on a revolver.
And 2.25 pounds, normal, average?
It's slightly lower than normal. Smith & Wesson factory specification is 3 pounds, but that's from the factory. So with use, it has the potential to wear down a little bit and decrease slightly.
Okay. You said with use?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
Pulling the trigger, shooting it, pulling the trigger.
A lot.
Right.
Okay. And with the question that you responded to the jurors about the safety features in the gun, whether it's in single or double action, can you tell the jurors if you are holding that gun and it's loaded and you hit a bump, if your finger's not on the trigger?
And again, come on. Can we have a hearing outside the presence?
Okay, we can after we're about to take our break when we finish with this witness. So I'm allowing a question.
Okay. And you're holding that gun and it's loaded, and you're in a vehicle that hits a bump. If your finger does not depress the trigger, will that gun go off?
And again, I'm gonna object to the form of that question.
Okay.
The hypothetical is going to include something that's in evidence. The hypothetical included something that wasn't in evidence and is way beyond the scope of cross.
Okay, I hear you on all those. I find this is responsive to one of the questions that was posed, and I'm going to allow the witness to answer.
Okay. I've said it twice. You understand the question, right?
So The movement of the gun should not fire the gun. It has to be a force acting on the trigger.
Thank you. Mr. Harvey, any follow-up?
As opposed to an accidental discharge, there is something that you know of that's called an unintentional discharge, correct?
Right.
And an unintentional discharge means that one can put pressure on the trigger unintentionally and that the weapon can discharge, correct?
Right.
For a number of reasons, including being startled, correct?
Right.
Sympathetic unintentional discharge, when you're doing something with one hand and the other hand squeezes the trigger, correct?
Sure.
It is a very common occurrence, especially with police officers, that there is unintentional discharge of firearms, correct?
That's venturing a little outside of my scope. However,
Well, then I object to the answer if it's outside the scope.
He brought up the subject, and if he doesn't know, he can say, I don't know.
I'll let him finish his answer, but he seems to be very mindful of where he's not assuming and where he is assuming, and we'll see what he says.
the presence of the double action in the design of the gun is supposed to act as a safeguard against that. So this is a double action, single action gun as opposed to a simply single action gun. Single action, with every shot you would have to pull the hammer back. That's what you're going to see in a John Wayne movie, in a cowboy gun. You have to pull the shot back or the hammer back for every shot. The double action design is so that you can have a ready gun, a gun that's ready to fire without having to create that light trigger pull.
And again, this weapon, as well as any other weapons, can be unintentionally discharged, correct?
It can be, yes.
All right. Mr. Weitzel, thank you for your time. Folks, we're going to take our afternoon break. I'm going to celebrate my victory over the fly. You guys can go back unmolested by the fly to the jury room. We'll get you back in here in about 10 minutes. Don't talk about the case, no outside research, and we will proceed accordingly. Thank you.
All rise for the jurors. Please be seated.
Mr. Rucker, anything before we break? Mr. Harvey, you had wanted to have a discussion outside the presence of the jury. They're outside. So if there's anything more you want to get on the record, I want to make sure we do that.
Yes, what I want to get on the record is that we are, I believe, being excessively liberal in allowing questions that are beyond the scope of what the juror questions ask. They were beyond the scope of cross-examination, and they allowed, and the court allowed Mr. Rucker to get into a whole new direct examination, which I think is incredibly unfair, especially since we don't get any recross. Or recross is typically not allowed by the court. So I really vigorously object to the court's liberal allowance of questions that are way beyond the scope of the juror's questions. And you know my position on the juror questions already. To allow a wholly new incorporated area of direct examination that could have been gone into and should have been gone into on direct, but I forgot, and now I've got the opportunity to do it, so I'm going to jump on it because I know the court's going to let me do it. So I'm moving for a mistrial. I know you're going to grant that.
We haven't been at this for very long, so why not?
I know.
Mr. Rucker, anything you want to say in response to the motion for mistrial?
I'd have to vote to deny it.
Okay. I'll try to be less liberal going forward. We'll see how that plays out. But I don't find that the one or two as opposed to a line, but maybe two makes it a line of questions were beyond the scope of questions that I posed to the witness after both sides had a chance to review juror questions. I thought they were related. They may have gotten into an area not covered on direct or cross, probably why the jurors had the question. And I will deny the motion for mistrial, and I will try to be more restrictive when it comes to both sides wanting to go outside whatever we decide the appropriate narrow scope is. Thanks. I'll see everyone in a few minutes.